So Anthemius sent envoys to the Sassanid court, and very respectfully renewed the terms that had kept the two empires at peace for the last generation. In other words, at just the right moment, Constantinople fell under the sway of an eminently practical man who did not suffer any trumped-up delusions of grandeur. He was not petty, he did not make politics personal, and he didn't appear to have much of an agenda beyond protecting and serving the empire. What made Anthemius' arrival so perfectly timed was the fact that Arcadius wound up dying on his watch in 408. As we've seen ad nauseum, transitions of imperial power can be times fraught with danger, and even though an heir was in place, that heir was just 7 years old. So opportunists of every shape and size were sharpening their long knives and getting ready to make their move. But with Anthemius firmly entrenched in power, the transition from Arcadius to the 7-year-old Theodosius II was, well, kind of anticlimactic. The prefect was able to provide a continuity of leadership and a continuity of policy that allowed him to buy a boy emperor without missing a beat. Child emperors are only as good as their regents, and not unlike Stilicho and Honorius, in Anthemius, Theodosius II had a rock-solid regent. Speaking of Stilicho, the only thing that really could have screwed up the transition of power in 408 would have been Stilicho showing up and making all kinds of noise about his own claim to power. Though I think it's a good thing that the trip never happened, it would have been kind of cool to see Stilicho and Anthemius square off in a fight for control of Constantinople. I don't particularly like Stilicho's chances, given the enormous home field advantage Anthemius would have enjoyed, but still, it would have made for some good theater. Sadly though, Stilicho was betrayed, and then he calmly allowed himself to be beheaded in order to nobly avert a civil war, which I suppose was pretty good theater too. Okay, so that brings us back up to where we left off last week. The East is now in the capable hands of Anthemius, while the West is presently falling into the bungling hands of Stilicho's successors. The bungling got started right away, when Olympius, the minister who had undermined Stilicho to death, decided to give in to the absolute worst impulses of his age. You'll recall that both the Italian nobility and the rank-and-file foot soldiers of the regular Roman army had been none too pleased about Stilicho's pro-barbarian policies, which were really just an extension of Theodosius's pro-barbarian policies, by the way. They didn't like taking orders from barbarian officers, they didn't like using gold to buy the support of barbarian kings, and they really, really didn't like Alaric and his Goths. With Stilicho out of the way, Olympius just went ahead and let all this irrational hatred off its leash. When Radagaisus was defeated in 406, those 12,000 Gothic warriors who were incorporated into Stilicho's army brought their families along with them. Essentially, their wives and children were exempted from being sold into slavery. These Gothic families were then split up and settled across dozens of Italian municipalities, partly to give them a place to live, but partly to act as hostages to keep the men in line. In the late summer 408, Olympius announced that the presence of Gothic families in Italian cities would no longer be tolerated. So, did he ask them nicely to leave? Did he send soldiers to forcibly eject them? No, he put out an order that they were all to be slaughtered. Literally, I want you to murder every Gothic woman and every Gothic child you can find. Whatever good Olympius thought this insanely cruel order would accomplish, and he must have thought it would accomplish something good, the only lasting impact it had was to drive those 12,000 warriors right out of the Roman camp. With Italy momentarily consumed by genocidal chaos, the Goth warriors abandoned their posts and marched straight for the one man who could offer them asylum: Alaric. In a flash, the Gothic king went from potentially marginalized figure in a post-Stilicho geopolitical world back to major player. Also in a flash, the Roman army lost 12,000 soldiers. Genocide is as morally reprehensible a thing as exists in the world, but rarely does it so immediately blow up in the face of the perpetrators. Really, the massacre of the Goth families was just so unbelievably stupid, I'm kind of at a loss for words. Alaric wasted no time seizing the day, and with the enthusiastic backing of his new revenge-minded recruits, he immediately marched them and the rest of his army over the Alps into Italy. With the regular Roman forces mostly prepared for the coming offensive against Constantine in Gaul, Alaric was able to pass into Italy without so much as an arrow being shot in his direction. Plus, with the addition of Radagaisus's Goths, Alaric now led an army comparable numerically to the Roman forces stationed at Pavia. Beating the Goths in battle now was by no means a sure thing, so the Roman high command couldn't take the risk of a direct confrontation. I mean, what if they lost? During Alaric's first invasion of Italy, he had kept mostly to the northern edges of the home province, since that's where the military and political centers of the Western Empire now were. But this time, he decided to play a more psychologically terrifying card. Bypassing Aquileia and Ravenna and Milan, Alaric led his Goths due south, on a beeline directly for Rome. Now at this point, Alaric had absolutely no intention of sacking the Eternal City. His plan was to simply set up a blockade, make demands, and wait for the Senate to cave. Which he did, and which they then did. Alaric surrounded the city, preventing all food and supplies from entering Rome, and then demanded 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, and all manner of silks and linens and furs to clothe his people. He also demanded the release of the 40,000-odd Goths who had been sold into slavery following Radagaisus's defeat. Not that he really needed to stand firm on that last point. As soon as Alaric entered Italy, most of the recently enslaved Goths just walked away from their new masters and joined his army. The Senate deemed the blockade obviously unbreakable and agreed to meet all of Alaric's demands. The slaves freed, the Senate humiliated, and the Goths now struggling under the weight of 35,000 pounds of precious metal, Alaric called off the blockade and returned north to negotiate further concessions from Honorius. Now the thing we must keep in mind about Alaric is that despite any preconceptions we might have about him being some rampaging barbarians because of the fact that, yes, he is about to sack Rome, this whole adventure, essentially the sack itself, were all just part of his larger struggle with the Western court for political recognition. At no point was Alaric engaged in some attempt to destroy the Roman Empire. Just the opposite. What he wanted more than anything else was a legitimate place for himself and his people within the Roman Empire. In initiating the blockade, he was demonstrating how powerful he now was. And in breaking off the blockade, he was demonstrating that he was fully capable of bargaining in good faith. So when he met with Honorius's agents in late 408 and early 409, he had every reasonable hope that an agreement could be reached, that the Romans would grant some sort of territorial independence to the Goths in Illyria, where they would be safe from future genocidal massacres, and that Alaric would once again be made a high-ranking general in the Roman army. But Honorius was still under the sway of the suicidally anti-barbarian Olympius, and so the negotiations went nowhere. Frustrated that the emperor did not seem to have gotten the message, in early 409 Alaric marched back to Rome and blockaded the city a second time. The people of Rome offered no resistance, and the cowed Senate seemed positively eager to help Alaric get what he wanted out of Honorius, because otherwise he was just going to keep showing up on their doorstep. While Alaric was once again encamped outside Rome, Honorius and his ministers took steps to ensure that they would be able to focus exclusively on the Gothic question, at least for the next little while. Headquartered up in Arles in Gaul, The usurper Constantine III was delighted when he opened up a package from Honorius one day in the spring of 409 and found that it contained a purple cloak. A clear signal that Ravenna now recognized Constantine's claim to Imperium over Gaul and Britain. In the great back and forth of imperial politics, Constantine had just been surpassed by Alaric as the greater threat, and so he suddenly got what he had been asking for the last 2 years. With the northern frontier temporarily free from the threat of invasion, Ravenna then turned its attention back to the question of Alaric and received an embassy of senators from Rome to help them talk through the issue. The senators, obviously, recommended that Honorius grant Alaric's demands. We don't like it any more than you do, but the Goths are just too strong at the moment. This is no time to get pig-headed. So when Alaric came back north to resume negotiations, things went a bit smoother. This time, the two sides agreed in principle to political independence for the Goths in Illyria, as well as an annual stipend of gold and grain to keep them happy and fed. But Honorius refused to yield on the point of giving Alaric an official position in the Roman military. Talks looked like they were about to break down again when Alaric shocked everyone by suddenly abandoning almost everything he had been asking for. Gone was the request for an independent Gothic state in Illyria. Gone were the payments of gold. Gone was the military commission. Instead, Alaric came back with a simple proposal. Let us go live along the Danube border in Noricum. Send us enough grain to help keep us fed, and we'll live in peace and defend the frontiers for you. In his excellent book, The Fall of the Roman Empire, Peter Heather speculates that this sudden about-face was driven by Alaric's long-range censorship, which picked up on the fact that though the Romans were weak now, they would not be weak forever. Take them to the cleaners today, and they may come back tomorrow when they're strong again, and take it all back with interest. But ask them for only a few supplies and the right to live in peace, and the Romans might consider us friends forever. Everyone expected the deal to go through. I mean, why wouldn't it? But at the 11th hour, Ravenna rejected all terms and broke off negotiations. There's probably something that explains this otherwise inexplicable rejection of what appears to be a criminally good deal for Rome, but we don't seem to have it. Alaric promised to go away for a song, and Honorius refused to sing. So Alaric packed his bags and headed back to Rome for the third time. When he got there, he decided to up the ante. He picked an amenable and influential senator of Greek origin named Priscus Attalus, and had the Senate proclaim their colleague Augustus of the Western Empire. If Honorius wasn't even going to pretend to play ball, then it was time to ditch him and recognize a whole new emperor. One who would actually listen to reason. So now there were three rival imperial courts in the west. Constantine III up in Arles, who was backed by a mix of regular troops and barbarian allies. Honorius in Ravenna, who was backed by some palace guards and the swamps of Ravenna. And Priscus, down in Rome, backed by Alaric and his Goths. Next time, we will throw them all into the octagon to see who winds up being the last